My grandfather stopped eating mid-bite. He stared across the dining room table, his eyes locking onto me with a sharpness that demanded an immediate answer. Wait a minute. You pay your parents' rent to live here. I froze with the wine bottle still hovering over my sister glass. Before I could answer him, my father waved his hand dismissively through the air, completely unbothered. Your sister has 2 kids, Maya. She needs the help more than you do. The entire table went completely silent. My grandfather slowly set down his silver fork. The heavy clink of the metal against his porcelain plate echoed in the quiet room. Nobody sitting there expected what he was going to say next. My name is Maya. I am 35 years old, and if you have ever sat at a holiday dinner table and realized the people who share your blood also share a deep desire to see you fail, you know exactly how I felt in that moment. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand your ground against a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. You will definitely want to stick around to hear how I served my eviction notices with dessert. The Thanksgiving dinner was taking place at my parents' sprawling estate in an exclusive gated neighborhood in Atlanta. To the outside world, my parents, Desmond and Valerie, were the absolute picture of African American excellence and generational wealth. They hosted charity galas, drove imported luxury vehicles, and made sure everyone at their country club knew exactly how perfect their life was. But the truth was far less glamorous. That massive brick estate did not belong to my father. It belonged to my grandfather Silas. Grandpa Silas was a self-made man. He grew up with absolutely nothing, fought his way through the hardest decades of this country, and eventually built a massive logistics and shipping company from a single-use delivery truck. When he retired, he placed the Atlanta estate into a family trust, handing the keys to my father free and clear. Grandpa Silas even paid the annual property taxes out of his own pocket, just to ensure his son and grandchildren would always have a secure roof over their heads. My parents loved the house, but they loved the status it gave them even more. They spent their days obsessing over appearances, and their favorite accessory in their curated life was my younger sister, Chloe. At 32 years old, Chloe was the undeniable golden child. She was beautiful, loud, and incredibly demanding. She had never worked a hard day in her life, but if you looked at her social media accounts, you would think she was a self-made millionaire. She projected the image of a wealthy, successful lifestyle influencer, posting photos of designer bags, luxury vacations, and perfectly plated brunches. Chloe was completely dependent on our parents for everything, but my mother and father gladly emptied their pockets for her because she gave them the ultimate prize. She had married Trent. Trent was 34 years old, a white man who spoke almost exclusively in corporate buzzwords. He wore expensive casual clothes, slicked back hair, and carried himself with an unbearable amount of entitlement. Trent called himself a tech startup founder. My parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on. To Desmond and Valerie, having a white tech entrepreneur as a son-in-law was the ultimate status symbol. It was their ticket into even more exclusive social circles. They bent over backward to accommodate his every whim, constantly praising his non-existent business acumen and treating him like the savior of our family legacy. They had 2 children, Leo and Mia, who were paraded around at family functions like little trophies before being quickly handed back to their nanny. Then there was me. I was the quiet, analytical older sister who never quite fit into my parents' desperate need for public validation. I did not care about designer labels or country club gossip. I cared about numbers, patterns, and building genuine security. My parents always introduced me to their friends with a tone of mild apology. They told everyone I was a low-level desk clerk or a simple bookkeeper who was still single and childless at 35. They had absolutely no idea that the quiet daughter they constantly dismissed was actually the founder and chief executive officer of Sterling Forensic Partners, a highly successful elite forensic accounting and wealth management firm. I built my company from the ground up, specializing in uncovering corporate fraud and securing assets for high net worth individuals. My firm handled accounts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I was quietly wealthy, completely independent, and deeply satisfied with my life. But I kept my success entirely hidden from my family. I knew exactly what they would do if they found out I had money. They would demand it, guilt-trip me for it, and ultimately try to channel it directly to Chloe and Trent. To maintain my cover and keep an eye on my aging grandfather, I had moved into the guest house on the estate property 3 years ago. I told my parents my modest bookkeeping salary was just enough to afford a small apartment, so they graciously offered to let me live in the guest house. What they did not tell the rest of the family was that they were quietly charging me an exorbitant amount of money to stay there. The Thanksgiving table was groaning under the weight of an immaculate feast. Valerie had spent 3 days directing a team of caterers to arrange the roasted turkey, the candied yams, the perfectly baked macaroni and cheese, and the cornbread dressing. We were seated in the formal dining room under a massive crystal chandelier. Trent was holding court, gesturing wildly with his wine glass as he talked about his latest supposed business venture. He was going on and on about disruption and paradigm shifts, using a lot of words to say absolutely nothing of substance. My father nodded along enthusiastically, acting as though Trent was revealing the secrets of the universe. Chloe sat next to him, admiring her own reflection in the blade of her butter knife, occasionally interrupting to complain about how difficult it was to find a reliable personal shopper. I sat quietly near the end of the table, listening to the hollow chatter. Grandpa Silas sat at the head of the table, silently observing everyone with his sharp, intelligent eyes. He had always been the only person in this family who saw through the nonsense. Trent held out his empty wine glass without even looking in my direction. He snapped his fingers twice. "Maya, be a doll and top this off, and grab the extra rolls from the kitchen while you are up." I looked at his outstretched hand. I felt a familiar coldness settle over me. I stood up, taking the wine bottle, and stepped over to his chair. I began to pour the red wine into his glass. Trent smirked, looking across the table at my father. "I have to say, Desmond, it is really fantastic that you keep Maya around. Having our own live and help in the guest house makes these dinners so much easier." He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. "And honestly, it is a great deal for her. Free rent in a neighborhood like this. She would be living in a shoebox downtown if you guys were not subsidizing her lifestyle. It really pays off to be the family charity case, right, Maya?" I stopped pouring the wine. I set the heavy glass bottle down on the mahogany table with a deliberate, slow movement. I looked down at Trent. His smug, arrogant smile was plastered across his face. He fully expected me to lower my head and walk back to the kitchen like a dutiful servant. "I pay $3,000 a month to live in that guest house, Trent." My voice was quiet, but it carried perfectly across the room. The sound of silverware scraping against plates came to an abrupt halt. Chloe stopped admiring her reflection. My mother, Valerie, stiffened in her chair, her eyes darting nervously toward the head of the table. Grandpa Silas had just taken a bite of dressing. He stopped chewing. He swallowed slowly, putting his napkin down on the table. He turned his head to look directly at my father. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Rent." Grandpa Silas spoke the word as if it left a foul taste in his mouth. "I gave you this estate free and clear in a trust, Desmond. I pay the property taxes every single year to make sure this family has a sanctuary." "Why the hell is Maya paying you rent?" Desmond began to sweat. He tugged at the collar of his expensive dress shirt, stammering as he tried to formulate a response. "Well, Dad, you see, it is just a matter of teaching responsibility. Maya is an adult. We cannot just give her free housing. It is a life lesson." Valerie scoffed loudly, waving her hand through the air to shut the old man down. "Oh, please do not be dramatic, Silas." She smoothed the napkin on her lap, looking at me with pure condescension. "Maya is a single woman with a dead-end desk job. She has no husband, no children, and no real responsibilities. Chloe and Trent have 2 beautiful children to raise. Leo and Mia need a proper environment. Plus, Trent is building a massive technology empire. His startup needs capital to get off the ground. Maya paying rent is just her contribution to the family. It is not like she needs the money for a family of her own." I stood there observing my mother. She had just publicly admitted to financially exploiting her oldest daughter to subsidize her youngest daughter's luxury lifestyle. She did not even sound ashamed. She sounded righteous. Valerie continued her rant, her voice taking on a vicious, mocking edge. It is exactly like when you helped pay for Chloe's destination bachelorette party in Cabo last year, Maya. It is your duty as her sister. You sit at a desk all day analyzing boring spreadsheets. Chloe is raising heirs to a legacy. Trent is out there making real moves in the business world. You should be grateful we allow you to live on the property at all. $3,000 a month is a steal for this zip code. You are contributing to the greater good of the family name. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not storm out of the room. I simply reached over, picked up my own wine glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the rich red wine coat my throat as I watched them completely expose their own toxic entitlement. My analytical brain was processing their panic, categorizing every lie and every justification. Grandpa Silas did not share my calm demeanor. I could see the muscles in his jaw ticking. This was a man who had fought through the civil rights era, who had broken his back loading trucks for decades to ensure his son would never know the sting of poverty. Now he was watching that same son turn into a parasite, enabling another parasite at the expense of his own granddaughter. Silas stood up. His heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. The sound made my mother flinch. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a folded legal document and held it tightly in his weathered hands. "Well, Valerie, that is truly fascinating." Grandpa Silas' voice was deep and rumbling, vibrating with a suppressed fury that demanded absolute attention. "Because according to this paperwork, Maya is not the only one paying for Trent's little startup, are you?" My father leapt up from his chair. His face was a mask of sheer panic and furious anger. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "See what you did. You ruined Thanksgiving. You just could not keep your mouth shut about the guest house, could you? You always have to make everything about you." Chloe chimed in, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Seriously, Maya, you are so bitter. Just because you have a sad, lonely life does not mean you have to drag us down. Family wealth belongs to the people who are actually building a legacy. Trent and I are the future of this family. You are just a glorified secretary." Trent leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine with a sneer. "If you cannot handle real family talk, Maya, maybe you should just go back to the guest house. Let the adults handle the big picture." Valerie glared at me. "Apologize to your sister right now. You are embarrassing her husband in front of his family. And since you want to bring up finances at the dinner table, we are raising your rent. Trent's business is about to go global, and they need bridge funding for the next quarter. Your rent is $4,000 starting on the 1st of the month. Consider it an investment in your brother-in-law's empire." Grandpa Silas slammed his open hand down on the table. The crystal glasses rattled, and a few drops of wine spilled onto the pristine white tablecloth. "He is not going global, Desmond. He is going to jail." Silas threw the folded document squarely onto the center of the table, right next to the turkey platter. It was a bank notice. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was a default warning from a major commercial lender. "I know what you did, Desmond." Grandpa Silas stared his son down. "You and Valerie forged my signature. You took out a second mortgage on my commercial warehouse district downtown. You stole $400,000 of my money, and you handed it directly to this useless fraud sitting at my table." The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the room felt thick-heavy with the sudden exposure of a massive felony. My parents had committed identity theft and wire fraud against their own father to fund their white son-in-law's fake business. Desmond did not collapse in shame. He did not apologize. Instead, he puffed out his chest, glaring at his elderly father with unrepentant arrogance. "So what? You are an old man, Dad. You do not even use that property anymore. You just sit on that wealth while Trent is out here innovating." Desmond gestured grandly toward Trent. "Vanguard Capital is auditing his company right now. Sterling Forensic Partners is conducting the review. They are the best in the business. Once Trent passes that audit tomorrow, he gets a $10 million Series B funding round. We will pay off your stupid mortgage next week, and you will get your money back with interest. So back off, old man." I set my wine glass down. The sharp clink echoed in the tense room. I looked at Trent, analyzing the sudden drop of color in his face. "Is that so, Trent? Trent forced a loud, grating laugh that bounced off the dining room walls, attempting to mask the sudden, visible panic in his eyes. He puffed out his chest, leaning back in his chair and adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt. He looked at me with the same patronizing smirk he had worn since the day Chloe brought him home. "What do you know about Series B funding, Maya?" Trent asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You sit in a cubicle and balance petty cash for local dry cleaners. Vanguard Capital does not hire glorified secretaries to look at their investments. They hire the best in the business. They hired Sterling Forensic Partners, a Tier 1 financial investigation firm. Their auditors are crawling all over my accounts right now, and they are finding absolutely nothing but massive growth potential and pristine bookkeeping. So do not try to act like you understand high-level corporate finance." I did not raise my voice. I did not react to his insult. My brain simply categorized his aggressive posture, his rapid blinking, and the sweat forming on his upper lip as classic indicators of a cornered fraudster. I reached down into my leather tote bag resting beside my chair. The dining room was completely silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating as everyone watched me pull out my tablet. I set the device gently on the mahogany table. I used my passcode to unlock the screen, opening the secure executive dashboard of my firm. The bright display illuminated the darkened room. Trent's company logo sat perfectly centered at the top of the screen, right next to a massive flashing red banner that read, "Flagged for criminal wire fraud." I pushed the tablet across the cranberry sauce in the fine china. It glided smoothly over the polished wood, coming to a dead stop right next to Trent's plate. "I know exactly who Vanguard hired, Trent." I stated, my voice completely void of emotion. "Because I did not just read your forensic audit. I wrote it." Trent looked down at the glowing screen. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the shade of wet ash. He stared at the official Sterling Forensic Partners letterhead, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Chloe leaned over his shoulder to look at the screen. She let out a shrill, nervous laugh, tossing her long hair back. She pointed a manicured finger at me, shaking her head. "This is pathetic, Maya. You actually sat in your sad little guest house and built a fake website just to ruin my Thanksgiving dinner. You are so obsessed with my husband, it is actually terrifying. Tell her to stop playing pretend dad. Make her put her stupid toy away." My father slammed his fist on the table, glaring at me. "Enough of this sick joke, Maya. Put that away right now before I lose my temper. You are embarrassing yourself." I ignored my father entirely. I kept my eyes locked on my brother-in-law, watching his breathing turn shallow and rapid. "I am not a desk clerk, Dad. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Sterling Forensic Partners. Vanguard Capital did not hire my firm to clear Trent for a $10 million funding round. They hired us 3 weeks ago because they smelled a rat. It was never a routine financial review. It was an active, targeted investigation into criminal wire fraud and embezzlement." The dining room erupted into absolute chaos. Valerie shot up from her chair, knocking her wineglass over. The dark liquid spilled across the white linen tablecloth like blood. She pointed her shaking finger directly at my face, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "You are a pathological liar." Valerie screamed, her carefully curated country club persona completely shattering. "You have always been insanely jealous of your sister. You have been bitter ever since we had to empty out your useless college savings account to pay for Chloe's destination wedding. We did that because Chloe actually deserved a wedding fit for a queen, and you were doing nothing with your life. You have harbored a sick grudge ever since we cut you off, and now you are fabricating government documents just to destroy her happiness." I did not flinch at the mention of my stolen college fund. I had spent the last 17 years building my empire from absolute zero precisely because they had drained my accounts to fund Chloe's vanity. I watched my mother rant, analyzing her sheer desperation to maintain her social status. Then I turned my attention back to the parasite sitting across from me. "Do you want to tell your wife where Grandpa Silas' $400,000 actually went, Trent?" I asked, my tone as casual as if I were asking for the salt. "Or should I read your exact banking receipts aloud to the entire table?" Trent lunged across the turkey platter. His hands clawed frantically at the tablet, desperate to hide the screen. I was faster. I snatched the device back, pulling it safely against my chest. I tapped the screen, opening the itemized ledger, and began to read his financial destruction aloud to the room. $0 spent on product development, I announced, my voice cutting through Valerie's screaming. $0 spent on software engineering, $0 spent on server hosting. You do not own a tech startup, Trent. You own a hollow shell company acting as a funnel for stolen money. Chloe gasped, gripping the edge of the table. Trent began to stammer, throwing his hands up in a placating gesture. Maya, you do not understand high-risk hedge investments. That money is tied up in offshore developmental portfolios. Line item 1. I continued, speaking right over his pathetic lies. $50,000 wired directly to an offshore sports betting syndicate in the Cayman Islands to cover massive gambling debts. Chloe whipped her head around to stare at her husband. Her eyes were wide with rising terror. Trent, what is she talking about? Tell me she is lying. Line item 2. $120,000 funneled into a private leasing agency in Atlanta. I looked directly at my sister, watching her perfect world crumble piece by piece. That money pays the monthly leases on the 2 luxury sports cars you constantly flaunt on your social media pages, Chloe. You do not own those cars. Your husband rented them using your grandfather's stolen retirement funds. Chloe let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She looked at Trent, demanding an explanation, but Trent was shrinking down into his chair, violently shaking his head and refusing to make eye contact with her. I did not stop. I delivered the final crushing blow without a shred of hesitation. And the remaining $230,000 was wired to a luxury real estate holding group in Miami, Florida. It pays the premium lease on a beachfront penthouse condo. The sole registered occupant of that penthouse is a 24-year-old fitness model named Isabella. She has been charging room service to your company credit card for the past 8 months. Chloe let out a primal, piercing scream that rattled the crystal chandelier above us. She grabbed her heavy crystal water goblet and hurled the contents directly into Trent's face. The freezing ice water splashed across his expensive shirt and dripped down his nose. She lunged at him, her manicured nails clawing wildly at his chest and shoulders. She screamed that he was a cheating, disgusting parasite, sobbing hysterically as she battered his arms. Valerie completely lost her mind. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy family was imploding in real time, and she needed a scapegoat. She marched around the large dining table, her face contorted with rage, and slapped the tablet directly out of my hands. The heavy device hit the hardwood floor with a violent crack. The screen shattered into a dozen glowing pieces. "You bitter, ugly, miserable spinster!" Valerie shrieked, kicking the broken tablet across the floor. "You fabricated this entire document just to ruin your sister's marriage. You are trying to destroy this family because nobody will ever love you." My father was not looking at the shattered glass on the floor. Desmond was staring into the middle distance, his chest heaving as the reality of his own impending doom settled over him. He was a man cornered by his own greed. If Trent went down for federal wire fraud, the investigators would immediately trace the original $400,000 back to its source. They would pull the commercial property documents. They would discover that Desmond and Valerie had blatantly forged Grandpa Silas' signature to secure the second mortgage. My parents were going to be indicted for identity theft, bank fraud, and elder abuse. Desmond's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He circled the table, moving with a sudden, terrifying speed. Before I could stand up, he grabbed my upper arm. His grip was vicious and bruising, his thick fingers digging deep into my skin. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. He was sweating profusely, his breath smelling of stale wine and absolute panic. "You are going to go back to that guest house right now," Desmond snarled, his voice shaking with a desperate, violent rage. "You are going to open your computer, you are going to log into your system, and you are going to clear his audit. You are going to issue a flawless financial report so he gets that Vanguard funding tomorrow morning." I looked at his hand gripping my arm, then looked up into his frantic, bloodshot eyes. I did not struggle. I did not blink. If you do not send that approval email tonight, Maya, I swear to God I will have you thrown out of that guest house immediately. Desmond tightened his grip, shaking my arm to emphasize his threat. I will call the police and have them drag you off my property in handcuffs for trespassing. We own the roof over your head. We own this family. You have absolutely nothing without our generosity. Clear the audit right now, or I will put you on the street and I will personally ruin your miserable little career. I stared up at my father. His face was a dark, mottled red, and the thick vein in his neck pulsed violently against his stiff white collar. He honestly believed his threat carried weight. He genuinely thought the fear of homelessness would force me to compromise my ethics, break federal laws, and clear an elite financial audit for a known criminal. He thought he still held all the cards. I am not clearing the audit, Dad. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying an absolute unbreakable finality. I am submitting the final forensic report to the Vanguard Capital Board of Directors first thing tomorrow morning. Desmond let out a deafening roar of frustration. He stepped back, running his hands aggressively over his bald head. That is it. You are completely done. I am calling the police right now and having you physically removed from my property. You are trespassing in my home. Valerie did not wait for the police to arrive. She stormed out of the formal dining room, her expensive high heels stomping angrily against the polished hardwood floor. A moment later, she marched back in, carrying my heavy winter coat and my designer purse. She hurled them directly at me with all her strength. The thick coat draped awkwardly over my shoulder and the leather purse crashed into my empty porcelain dinner plate, knocking over a crystal water goblet. The ice water spilled across the table, soaking into the pristine white linen. "Get out!" Valerie shrieked, her face contorted into an ugly, hateful mask that completely destroyed her refined country club persona. "Get out of my house. You are nothing but an ugly, ungrateful dropout, and you have absolutely no place in this family." She stood over me, her chest heaving with exertion, using the exact same vicious tone she had used 17 years ago. "You have always been a miserable, jealous burden," she screamed, spit flying from her lips. "We cut you off at 18 for a very good reason. We took your useless college fund because Chloe actually needed a proper designer wedding dress and you were just wasting our money on community college business classes. You have always tried to drag your sister down to your level. You should be on your knees thanking us for letting you live in that guest house." I slowly picked up my purse from the wet table, brushing a few drops of spilled water off the smooth leather. I did not react to her screaming admission. She had just broadcasted her own guilt to the entire room, publicly admitting that they had deliberately drained my college savings to buy a dress for Chloe, forcing me to build my entire life and my multi-million-dollar company from absolute scratch. Chloe was sobbing uncontrollably into her linen napkin, her expensive mascara running down her face in thick black streaks. But I knew she was not crying because her sister had been emotionally and financially abused. She was crying because her leased luxury cars and her fake wealthy lifestyle were evaporating before her very eyes. Suddenly, Trent pushed his chair back so hard it nearly tipped over. He stood up, his expensive tailored suit wrinkled and damp from Chloe's earlier attack. The charming, bumbling tech entrepreneur facade was completely gone. In its place was a cornered, desperate, cowardly animal. He pointed a violently shaking finger at Desmond and Valerie. "Do not think you are going to put this all on me," Trent snarled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "If I go down for federal wire fraud, I am not going down alone. If Vanguard Capital pulls my funding and the Federal Bureau of Investigation shows up at my door, I am telling them exactly where that initial seed money came from. I will tell them you two explicitly forged Silas' signatures on those commercial real estate loans. We will all go to federal prison together." Desmond and Valerie froze in their tracks. The entire family dynamic shifted in the blink of an eye. The blind loyalty they had so desperately demanded from me was entirely absent in their golden son-in-law. They were turning on each other like rats trapped in a sinking ship. Trent turned his desperate, wild eyes toward me. He leaned heavily against the dining table, gripping the edge so hard his knuckles turned white. He thought he had found the perfect blackmail material to force my hand. "You hear that, Maya?" Trent breathed heavily, a frantic edge to his voice. "If you do not log into your system and clear my audit right this second, you are not just ruining my life. You are sending your own mother and father to a federal penitentiary. They committed felony bank fraud to give me that cash. Do you really want to be the reason your parents end up in prison jumpsuits? Clear the report, Maya. Save your family. I looked at my mother. Valerie's hands were shaking uncontrollably. She was staring at Trent in absolute paralyzed horror, finally realizing that the man she had worshipped and funded with stolen money was entirely willing to throw her in a cage to save his own skin. Grandpa Silas had been sitting silently through this entire chaotic exchange. His face was a mask of absolute unadulterated disgust. He looked at his sweating son, his trembling daughter-in-law, and the pathetic fraud they had brought into his home. Silas slowly reached into his tailored trouser pocket and pulled out his cell phone. I have heard enough. Grandpa Silas said, his voice rumbling deeply, like distant thunder. I am not waiting for Vanguard to pull their funding. I am calling the authorities myself. I am reporting the forgery and the embezzlement right now. Valerie let out a sound that was less human and more like a cornered beast. She lunged across the dining room with terrifying speed. She ripped the cell phone directly out of the 78-year-old man's hands. She shoved Grandpa Silas hard by the shoulders, forcing him back into his heavy wooden dining chair before he could stand. Valerie backed away quickly, clutching his phone tightly to her chest. She moved until she was physically blocking the heavy mahogany double doors leading out of the dining room. Her eyes were wide and frantic, darting between everyone in the room like a trapped animal. Nobody is calling anybody. Valerie shrieked, her shrill voice echoing off the high ceilings. Nobody is leaving this room until this problem is fixed. Desmond realized his father was no longer an ally. He realized his son-in-law was a massive liability. The only way out of this nightmare was to force me to comply with their demands. He took a heavy, threatening step toward me. He was a large, imposing man, and he used every inch of his height to try and physically intimidate me. Take out your phone, Maya, Desmond ordered. His voice was low, dangerous, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. Open your email application. You are going to message the Vanguard board right now. You are going to tell them the audit is pristine and you authorize the immediate release of the $10 million funding round. I looked up at him, my face completely blank and unbothered by his posturing. And if I do not, Desmond sneered, his upper lip curling in absolute disgust. We own the roof over your head. We own this family. You are absolutely nothing without our charity. If you do not send that email, I am throwing you out on the street tonight. I will make sure everyone in our social circle knows you went crazy and tried to ruin your sister's marriage out of pure jealousy. You will have no home, no family, and no reputation. You have 5 seconds to take out your phone and send that email or you are homeless. 5. I did not reach for my purse. I did not pull out my phone. I did not open my email. I simply lifted my left wrist and casually checked the face of my diamond designer watch. 4. Desmond counted, his face turning a deeper shade of purple. 3. Actually, Dad. I interrupted, my voice perfectly calm, cutting smoothly through the silent, suffocating tension in the room. The final wire transfer went through at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon. Valerie let out an exasperated sigh, dramatically rolling her eyes toward the crystal chandelier. Put your little toy away, Maya, my mother snapped. We are having a serious discussion about the future of this family. You do not need to sit there playing games while your brother-in-law explains how real wealth is generated. You should be taking notes. Maybe if you actually paid attention to Trent, you would not be stuck doing menial data entry at your age. I ignored my mother entirely. I kept my eyes locked on Trent. Tell me more about Sterling Forensic Partners. I said, my tone completely even betraying absolutely no emotion. They sound incredibly rigorous. Trent took the bait immediately. His fragile ego could not resist the opportunity to lecture me to prove his superiority in front of my parents, who hung on his every word. They are ruthless, Trent bragged, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. They do not just look at profit and loss statements, Maya. They dig into the architecture of the business. They verify international wire transfers, cross-reference offshore holdings, and validate vendor contracts. It is a forensic deep dive. Vanguard Capital only uses them when they are about to write a massive check because Sterling Forensic Partners never misses a single discrepancy. And my company just passed their preliminary review with flying colors. My father Desmond nodded vigorously, his panic from Grandpa Silas' threat momentarily subsiding as he basked in Trent's fabricated glory. Exactly, Desmond said, pointing a finger at me. Trent is operating on a level you cannot even comprehend, Maya. He is securing a $10 million valuation while you are complaining about paying a fair market rental rate for the guest house. This is why we prioritize Trent's business. He is building a generational empire for your sister and your niece and nephew. Chloe chimed in, swirling her wine glass and looking at me with pure pity. It is actually sad that you are trying to interrogate him, Maya. You have been jealous of Trent since the day we got married. Just because you failed out of your accounting program and had to settle for a basic bookkeeping job does not give you the right to question my husband. His startup is revolutionizing the tech industry. His developers are writing code that will change the world. I cataloged that specific lie. Trent had 0 developers on his payroll. He had 0 lines of code. He had a shell company, a rented virtual office space, and a massive gambling addiction. But I did not interrupt her. I let them build their house of cards higher and higher, knowing exactly how hard it was about to crash down. So I asked, my voice deadly calm, "You are absolutely certain that Sterling Forensic Partners is conducting the audit? There is no confusion about the firm handling the Vanguard Capital review." Trent scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I know exactly who is auditing my company, Maya. I have been on conference calls with their senior analysts all week. They are the apex predators of Wall Street accounting. They hire former federal agents and financial prodigies. They would eat a low-level clerk like you for breakfast. My books are immaculate. Every single penny is accounted for, and Vanguard is wiring the $10 million into my corporate account tomorrow morning. The audit is a mere formality at this point." Grandpa Silas sat at the head of the table, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not say a word, but his sharp eyes darted between Trent's sweating face and my perfectly steady hands. He knew I was setting a trap. He had always been the only person in this family who actually saw me, who recognized the quiet intelligence my parents so desperately tried to suppress. I tapped the screen of my tablet to wake it up. The bright display illuminated the darkened dining room, casting a pale glow across the holiday feast. I used my passcode to unlock the device, bypassing the standard home screen and navigating directly to the secure executive dashboard of my firm. The software required a secondary biometric scan. I pressed my thumb to the sensor, confirming my top-tier clearance. The system opened instantly. Trent's company logo sat perfectly centered at the top of the screen. Right next to his fabricated corporate logo was a massive flashing red banner that read, "Flagged for criminal wire fraud." Below the banner was a heavily redacted 90-page forensic financial breakdown, detailing every single stolen dollar, every offshore account, and every fake vendor invoice Trent had generated over the last 18 months. I looked up from the screen. Trent was staring at me, his arrogant smirk beginning to falter as he noticed the cold surgical precision in my movements. "Are you quite finished lecturing me about corporate finance, Trent?" I asked. Desmond slammed his hand on the table. "Put that tablet away right now and apologize to him, Maya. You are acting like an insolent child." I did not put the tablet away. Instead, I placed it flat on the mahogany table. I placed my fingertips against the edge of the device and pushed. The tablet glided smoothly over the polished wood, sliding right through the center of the Thanksgiving spread past the gravy boat and the cranberry sauce. It came to a dead stop right next to Trent's dinner plate. Trent looked down at the glowing screen. I watched the exact second his brain processed the official Sterling Forensic Partners letterhead. I watched him read the criminal fraud warning. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the shade of wet ash. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His breathing stopped completely. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I looked dead into his panicked, terrified eyes. "I know exactly who Vanguard Capital hired Trent," I said, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. Trent sat entirely motionless, His lungs seemed to have forgotten how to draw in air. The smug, arrogant mask he had worn for years simply dissolved, sliding off his face to reveal the terrified hollow fraud hiding underneath. He stared at the glowing screen of my tablet, his eyes locked on the official seal of my firm and the glaring red banner declaring criminal wire fraud. He did not blink. He did not speak. The only movement came from a single bead of cold sweat that materialized at his temple and slowly tracked down the side of his face, catching the light of the crystal chandelier above us. The silence in the formal dining room was absolute. The clinking of silverware had stopped. The ambient holiday music playing softly from the corner speakers suddenly sounded deafening. Chloe broke the silence. She let out a high, brittle sound that was meant to be a dismissive laugh, but came out sounding like a choked gasp. She leaned forward, squinting at the screen, and then quickly looked at her husband. When Trent did not immediately offer a witty retort or a condescending explanation, Chloe turned her aggressive energy toward me. "You are literally insane, Maya." Chloe said, her voice shaking as she tossed her hair over her shoulder. "You actually sat in your sad little guest house and paid someone to build a fake dashboard. Or what, did you code it yourself? You are so obsessed with Trent's success that you are playing pretend at the Thanksgiving table. It is pathetic." She reached across the table and tapped the glass of the tablet with her long, manicured fingernail. "Tell her to stop playing pretend, Trent. Tell her how ridiculous she looks right now." Trent did not move. He kept staring at the screen, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. Valerie seized the opportunity to pile on her country club poise, returning as she found a familiar target. "Your sister is right, Maya. This is beyond embarrassing. You have always harbored this sick, pathetic jealousy toward Chloe because she actually built a life for herself. You sit in a cubicle all day doing menial data entry, and you think you can just fabricate a lie about a multi-million-dollar tech firm. You do not even know what a Series B funding round is. You are ruining Thanksgiving with your bitter delusions. Put that toy away before I have your father escort you back to the guest house." I did not raise my voice. I did not react to my mother's venom or my sister's desperate denial. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, leaning back in my chair. I looked directly at my brother-in-law, watching his tailored suit suddenly appear 2 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. "I am not a desk clerk, Valerie," I stated, my voice echoing evenly across the mahogany table. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Sterling Forensic Partners. I built the firm from the ground up 8 years ago. We do not handle petty cash. We handle Tier 1 financial investigations for the largest private equity firms on the Eastern Seaboard." Desmond scoffed loudly, waving a hand in the air. "Oh, please. If you were a CEO, you would not be living in my guest house paying me rent. You would have moved out years ago." "I lived in the guest house to keep an eye on Grandpa Silas," I replied, my gaze briefly flicking to my grandfather, who was watching the scene unfold with an expression of intense, quiet pride. "And I gladly paid your exorbitant rent because it was pocket change to me, and it kept you entirely blind to my actual net worth. You only see what you want to see, Dad. You wanted a failure of an oldest daughter to make your golden child look better by comparison, so I let you believe the illusion. It made my work significantly easier." I turned my attention back to Trent. He was gripping the edge of the dining table so tightly, his knuckles were completely white. "Vanguard Capital did not hire my firm to clear you for a funding round, Trent." I continued, my tone surgical and precise. "They hired us 3 weeks ago because their internal risk management algorithms flagged your entire corporate structure as a massive liability. They did not want a routine audit. They hired me to investigate you for federal wire fraud." Trent finally moved. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to summon the corporate buzzwords he usually hid behind. "You do not understand the architecture of our business model." Trent stammered, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. It came out thin and reedy. "We have proprietary algorithms. We have offshore developmental teams handling the beta testing. You are misinterpreting standard venture capital cash flow as something malicious." I did not let him finish. I systematically dismantled his illusion right in front of his captive audience. You do not have proprietary algorithms, Trent. You do not even have a product, I said, leaning forward slightly, letting the full weight of my investigation press down on him. I pulled the server logs myself. Your company website is a shell template purchased for $40. Your active user metrics are generated by a bot farm you hired out of Eastern Europe. You have 0 engineers on your payroll. You have 0 lines of code. What you do have is a highly sophisticated funnel designed to take investor capital and immediately route it into untraceable private holding accounts. Chloe let out another sharp gasp. She looked from me to Trent, her eyes wide with rising panic. Trent, tell her she is lying. Tell them about the software. Tell them about the beta launch. Trent could not look at his wife. He stared down at his half-eaten plate of turkey, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. Desmond, however, was not ready to surrender the fantasy. His own financial survival was entirely dependent on Trent securing that $10 million funding. If Trent was a fraud, Desmond was ruined. This is slander. Desmond shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. You are sitting at my table slandering a brilliant businessman because you are a bitter, lonely woman. Trent is passing that audit tomorrow morning. Vanguard is wiring the money. They told him the review was practically finished. It is finished, Dad, I confirmed calmly. I signed off on the final report at 4 o'clock this afternoon. But Vanguard is not wiring $10 million to his account. They are handing my forensic report directly to the federal authorities. They are preparing to press charges for attempted embezzlement and wire fraud. Your brilliant businessman is going to be indicted before the end of the fiscal quarter. The dining room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating the thick layers of entitlement and denial my family had built around themselves. Valerie was staring at me with her mouth slightly open, the realization dawning in her eyes that the daughter she had mocked for years possessed the power to destroy her carefully curated world. Chloe was breathing rapidly, clutching her napkin to her chest, waiting for Trent to defend himself. But Trent had nothing left. His entire life was built on projecting an image of wealth he did not possess, using money he had not earned. I watched him physically crumble his arrogant posture, folding inward as the walls closed around him. He had spent years treating me like the hired help, ordering me to pour his wine and fetch his bread rolls, completely unaware that I held his entire future in the palm of my hand. I was not finished. The corporate fraud was only half of the investigation. It was the personal betrayal, the absolute theft from the man sitting at the head of the table that required immediate and brutal exposure. Vanguard Capital was concerned about their $10 million. I was concerned about my grandfather's life savings. I reached over and picked up my wine glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich red liquid coat my throat. I set the glass back down on the mahogany table. The sharp clink of the crystal echoed loudly in the quiet room. I leaned forward, folding my arms on the table, and leveled a gaze of absolute ice at the man who had stolen from my family. Trent opened his mouth, but only a dry, hollow rasp emerged. His eyes darted wildly toward the dining room doors, operating on pure animal instinct, silently calculating the exact distance to his escape. I did not give him the chance to formulate a lie or plot his retreat. I pulled the iPad back toward me, my finger hovering over the illuminated screen. Let us start with your operational expenditure, I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating silence of the room like a scalpel. I tapped the primary ledger file, bringing up the categorized expense report. Your company prospectus claims you are developing revolutionary predictive software. Yet, according to the bank records Vanguard Capital legally compelled you to hand over, you have spent exactly $0 on product development. You have spent $0 on software engineering. You have 0 lines of code registered, 0 patents pending, and 0 developers on your payroll. Your groundbreaking tech startup is nothing but a registered shell company operating out of a virtual mailbox in a downtown strip mall. Trent gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles bone white. Maya, you do not understand the incubation phase of early-stage tech development. He stammered, his voice climbing an octave. We outsource our foundational coding to offshore teams. The capital is temporarily tied up in international vendor holds while we secure the architecture. I swiped to the next page of the forensic dashboard without breaking eye contact. Line item 1. $150,000 wired in 5 separate installments directly to an offshore sports betting syndicate based in the Cayman Islands. I paused, letting the magnitude of the dollar amount hang in the stagnant air. Is that your offshore developmental team, Trent? Because my investigators traced those specific routing numbers directly to a high-stakes gambling ring. You took my grandfather's money to cover your massive betting losses. Chloe let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She looked at her husband, her perfectly contoured face twisting in confusion. Trent, what is she talking about? Tell her she is crazy. Tell her to shut up. Trent refused to look at his wife. He stared fixedly at the center of his dinner plate, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. I scrolled down to the next highlighted section. Line item 2. $100,000 funneled into a private luxury leasing agency right here in Atlanta. I shifted my gaze to my younger sister, watching the smug entitlement drain from her features. That money pays the premium monthly leases on the 2 imported luxury SUVs you constantly flaunt on your social media pages, Chloe. You do not own those vehicles. Your husband leased them under your name using Grandpa Silas' stolen equity. You are personally on the hook for those astronomical payments the second this fake company officially collapses. Chloe recoiled as if she had been physically struck. No. She practically squealed, shaking her head aggressively. No, you are lying. Trent bought those cars in cash. He showed me the paperwork. You are just making this up because you are sick with jealousy. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply delivered the final crushing blow with absolute precision. And then there is the real estate. The remaining $150,000 was wired over the course of 8 months to a luxury property management group in Miami, Florida. It pays the lease on a beachfront penthouse condo. Desmond and Valerie were frozen in their chairs watching their golden son-in-law completely disintegrate. Chloe gripped the tablecloth, her voice trembling. We do not have a condo in Miami, Trent. We do not go to Miami. You do not go to Miami. Chloe, I corrected gently. But Trent certainly does. The sole registered occupant of that penthouse is a 24-year-old fitness model named Isabella. According to the corporate credit card receipts my firm pulled, your husband has been flying down to visit her every other weekend under the guise of meeting with angel investors. He has charged thousands of dollars in room service, expensive jewelry, and boutique lingerie to his corporate expense account. He has been fully funding a second life with his mistress while you play house here in Atlanta. The dining room erupted into sheer, unadulterated chaos. Chloe let out a primal, ear-splitting scream that rattled the fine crystal on the table. She shoved her chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. You are a liar, Chloe shrieked at the top of her lungs, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. You are a disgusting, pathetic liar. You made all of this up because you are a jealous, bitter loser who has never had a man look at you twice. You cannot stand that I have a perfect husband and a perfect life. You spent weeks making fake documents in your sad little guest house just to ruin my Thanksgiving. She grabbed her heavy water goblet and hurled it across the table. It narrowly missed my head, smashing against the brick wall behind me and showering the floor in water and broken glass. Trent threw his hands up, trying to grab her wrists, stammering out incoherent apologies and begging her to calm down, which only incensed her further. She began hitting him, sobbing hysterically as the illusion of her wealthy, flawless existence went up in flames. But Valerie was not looking at her crying daughter. Valerie was looking at the glowing iPad sitting on the table. In that screen, my mother saw the absolute destruction of her social standing. She saw the end of her country club memberships, the end of her charity galas, and the exposure of the massive felony she had committed to fund this farce. She realized that if this audit was submitted to Vanguard, her son-in-law would be arrested, and the money trail would lead federal investigators straight to her forged mortgage documents. Valerie snapped. The carefully curated mask of the polite society matriarch melted away, replaced by pure, desperate malice. She marched around the large dining table, her face contorted with rage. She lunged at me, reaching across the cranberry sauce and the roasted turkey, and slapped the iPad directly off the table with a vicious swipe of her hand. The heavy device hit the hardwood floor with a sickening crunch. The glass screen shattered instantly, sending a spiderweb of cracks across the display before going completely black. "You bitter, miserable spinster!" Valerie screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You sit there in your cheap clothes and fabricate official government documents just to destroy your sister. You are a toxic, hateful woman. You think because you work as a low-level bookkeeper you can suddenly pretend to be a CEO. You are trying to tear this family apart because you are so profoundly unhappy with your own pathetic existence." I sat perfectly still, looking at the shattered glass of my device on the floor. I was not angry. I was calculating. Valerie was reacting emotionally to the loss of her status, but Desmond was reacting differently. My father was not screaming at me. He was standing near the head of the table, sweating profusely. His face was a dark mottled red, and a thick vein pulsed visibly at his temple. Desmond was a man who understood numbers. He understood that the $10 million Series B funding from Vanguard Capital was his only lifeline. It was the only way to quickly pay back the $400,000 they had stolen from Grandpa Silas before the bank noticed the fraudulent signatures. Without that Vanguard money, Desmond was not just going to be embarrassed. He was going to federal prison for elder abuse and bank fraud. Desmond's self-preservation overrode whatever shred of parental instinct he had left. He saw his freedom slipping away, and he moved with a sudden violent urgency. He circled the table, his heavy footsteps thudding against the floorboards. Before I could stand up or pull away, he grabbed my upper arm. His grip was brutal, his thick fingers digging painfully into my skin as he yanked me slightly out of my chair. I looked up into his frantic, bloodshot eyes. He was breathing heavily, his breath smelling of stale wine and sheer terror. He honestly believed his physical intimidation could force me to compromise my firm, break federal laws, and save him from his own crimes. "You are going to log into your system and clear his audit right now, Maya." Desmond snarled, his voice a low, dangerous threat that vibrated with panic. "You are going to approve his company and send that report to Vanguard immediately, or I swear to God I will have you thrown out of that guest house tonight, and I will ruin your miserable little career." I looked down at the large red hand gripping my arm, then slowly lifted my gaze to meet my father's manic eyes. I did not struggle. I did not try to pull away. I simply let the silence stretch until the sheer weight of my calm made his breathing falter. "Remove your hand from my arm, Desmond," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the dining room with absolute authority. "If you leave a single bruise on my skin, I will add physical assault to the comprehensive list of federal charges my firm is currently preparing against this family. And unlike your son-in-law, I do not make empty threats." Desmond jerked his hand back as if my skin had suddenly turned to scalding iron. He stumbled backward, colliding with the edge of the buffet table. But the panic in his chest quickly metastasized into blind, irrational fury. He pointed a trembling finger at the front door. "I am calling the police!" Desmond roared, spit flying from his lips. "I am calling the local precinct right now and having you arrested for trespassing. You are sitting at my Thanksgiving table in my house threatening my family with fabricated documents. You are a trespasser, Maya. I want you out of this house, and I want you out of my guest house by midnight." "You cannot evict someone without 30 days written notice, Dad," I replied, smoothing out the sleeve of my blouse. "Especially someone who has a legally binding lease agreement and digital receipts of rent payments. Furthermore, the police will be highly interested in the forensic accounting files backed up on my secure cloud servers. Do you really want to invite law enforcement into this house tonight?" Before Desmond could formulate a response to his own legal trap, Valerie completely lost whatever remained of her fragile grip on reality. The elegant, soft-spoken matriarch of the local country club vanished, replaced by a vicious, cornered woman whose entire identity was built on financial lies. Valerie marched over to the side chair where I had placed my belongings. She grabbed my wool winter coat and my leather tote bag. With a guttural scream, she hurled them across the room. The heavy bag slammed into my shoulder before crashing to the hardwood floor, spilling my keys, pens, and secondary work phone. "Get out!" Valerie shrieked, the veins in her neck protruding sharply. "You ugly, ungrateful dropout. You have absolutely no place in this home. You have never belonged in this family. You are a toxic, jealous spinster who cannot stand to see her younger sister thriving." I stood up slowly, brushing a piece of lint from my trousers. I did not bend down to retrieve my things. I kept my eyes locked on my mother, watching her unravel. "Thriving?" I asked, my tone dripping with clinical detachment. "Chloe is married to a man who leases her cars with stolen money and funds a mistress in Miami. If that is your definition of thriving, Valerie, your standards are even lower than I calculated." Valerie marched right up to me, her face mere inches from mine. "You know absolutely nothing about building a life." She spat, her voice trembling with decades of suppressed venom. "We gave you everything and you threw it away. You dropped out of your accounting program. You became a failure. We were entirely right to cut you off financially. You never deserved a single cent of that money anyway." I stared at her, allowing her own words to hang in the stagnant air of the dining room. "Cut me off," I repeated quietly. "When I was 18 years old, my college tuition fund completely vanished. For years, Desmond and Valerie had told me that the stock market had taken a downturn, that the investments had failed, and that the family simply did not have the liquidity to pay for my university education. I was forced to drop out of my prestigious accounting program halfway through my second semester. I spent the next 6 years working 3 grueling jobs, sleeping in my rusted car between shifts, and eating discarded food from the diner where I waitressed. I built sterling forensic partners from absolute zero, utilizing public library computers and sheer unadulterated willpower. Valerie was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at me. The adrenaline of the confrontation was making her careless. She wanted to hurt me, to find the deepest wound and twist the knife. "Do you think Chloe's Vera Wang gown paid for itself?" Valerie screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Do you think a $200,000 country club wedding just magically appears out of thin air? You were studying to be a miserable little desk clerk. Chloe was marrying a visionary. We took your college fund because it was a necessary investment in this family's future. You were never going to amount to anything anyway." The confession hung in the room, heavy and toxic. Grandpa Silas, who had remained entirely silent up until this moment, slowly placed his linen napkin on the table. He turned his sharp, weathered face toward his daughter-in-law. "You stole her tuition money?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous, rumbling like distant thunder. "You stole the education fund I set up for Maya to pay for a wedding dress." Valerie froze. The realization of what she had just confessed in front of my grandfather finally penetrated her rage. Silas was the patriarch. He still held the majority equity in the family trust. Valerie stumbled backward, her hands flying up in a defensive gesture. "Silas, please, you do not understand the social pressures we were under," Valerie stammered, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "The wedding had to be perfect. Trent was bringing prominent investors. We had to match his level of wealth. It was an investment in their future." I looked at my sister. Chloe was sitting on the floor amid the shattered glass and spilled water from her thrown goblet, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick black rivers. She was staring at Valerie, completely oblivious to the fact that her dream wedding was funded by my stolen education. I cataloged the confession, filing it away for the civil suit I was already preparing against my parents. They had not just abandoned me, they had actively robbed me to fund their golden child's vanity project. They had forced me into poverty, mocked me for my struggles, and demanded I pay rent to live in a guest house on property that was maintained by my own stolen inheritance. "You are thieves," I said, my voice echoing with icy finality. "Every single one of you. You steal from your own children, you steal from your own father, and you use the money to lease a fantasy you cannot afford." Trent had been standing frozen near the end of the table, watching the family turn on itself. He looked from the shattered screen of my iPad on the floor to the terrified faces of his in-laws. The realization finally hit him. Desmond and Valerie had absolutely no power here. They could not force me to clear the audit. They could not protect him from the federal authorities. They were completely and utterly impotent. The charming, charismatic tech bro persona Trent had perfected over the last 5 years melted away entirely. His shoulders hunched, his jaw jutted forward, and the sheer ugly desperation of a cornered predator took over. He stepped away from Chloe, ignoring her quiet sobs on the floor. He turned his back on his wife and focused his entire venomous attention on Desmond and Valerie. "You told me she was a data entry clerk." Trent snarled, his voice guttural and ugly. "You told me your oldest daughter was a failure who pushed papers for dry cleaners. You sat in my office and swore she had no access to corporate financial systems." "Trent, please." Desmond started holding up his hands in a desperate plea for calm. "We did not know. We had no idea she was running an investigation firm. We can fix this. We can hire lawyers. We can transfer the equity from the house." "Fix this," Trent shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. "There is no fixing a federal wire fraud indictment, Desmond. Vanguard is handing her report to the FBI tomorrow morning. Do you understand what that means? It means my accounts are frozen. It means my passport is flagged. It means the game is over." Trent stalked toward his father-in-law, closing the distance until they were chest to chest. Desmond shrank back, intimidated by the sudden physical aggression from the man he had idolized just 20 minutes prior. "You are not going to pin this entirely on me," Trent hissed, jabbing a rigid finger into Desmond's chest. "I am not going down alone while you two play the innocent victims." Desmond's eyes widened in sheer terror. "Trent, do not do this. We are family. Family." Trent barked a harsh, bitter laugh. "You only care about family when it benefits your bank account. If Vanguard pulls that funding, the bank is going to audit your commercial accounts to verify the collateral, and we both know exactly what they are going to find." Valerie let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. I stood perfectly still, watching the mutiny unfold. There is no honor among thieves, and watching them tear each other apart was the most satisfying Thanksgiving entertainment I could have asked for. "If I go down for fraud," Trent snarled, pointing directly at his in-laws, his voice echoing through the opulent dining room, "I am telling the feds you two forged the signatures on the commercial loans. I am handing over the emails. I am handing over the doctored appraisals. We all go to federal prison." The room erupted. Not with noise, but with a sudden terrifying vacuum of air as the gravity of Trent's words settled over the table. Federal prison. The two words hung suspended in the formal dining room, infinitely heavier than the crystal chandelier above our heads. Desmond stumbled backward from his son-in-law, as if he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. The angry, mottled red flush completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. Valerie stood frozen over the shattered remains of my tablet on the hardwood floor, her hands trembling uncontrollably by her sides. "You would not dare," Desmond whispered. His voice was stripped of all its former bravado, reduced to a hollow, pathetic rasp. "We gave you everything, Trent. We leveraged our entire commercial real estate portfolio to give you the seed money for your beta launch. We trusted you. We brought you into this family." Trent let out a sharp, barking laugh that lacked any trace of warmth or humor. "You did not trust me, Desmond. You got greedy. You wanted the $10 million Vanguard capital valuation just as badly as I did, because you are drowning in a mountain of debt. You forged your own father's signature on those commercial loan documents because your credit is absolute garbage, and the bank was preparing to foreclose on this very house. Do not stand there and act like you are the innocent victim here. We are co-conspirators. And if Maya pushes that button and sends the federal authorities to my door, my very first phone call will be to the federal prosecutor. I will offer them the patriarch and matriarch of this family on a silver platter in exchange for immunity." Chloe was still sitting on the floor amid the spilled water and broken glass. She looked back and forth between her husband and her parents, her perfect manicured world collapsing in real time. "Mom." Chloe sobbed, her voice high and frantic, cracking with pure terror. "Mom, what is he talking about? Tell him he is lying. You did not forge Grandpa's signature. You did not break the law. Tell him you did not do it." Valerie could not even look at her favorite daughter. She stared blankly at the floral wallpaper, her jaw trembling. Her absolute silence was a louder confession than any spoken words could have provided. Chloe let out a hollow, agonizing wail, pulling her knees to her chest and rocking back and forth on the wet floorboards. Trent turned his back on his weeping wife. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive Italian jacket, attempting to regain some semblance of the powerful, untouchable tech executive he had spent the last 5 years pretending to be. He took a slow, calculated step toward me, locking his desperate, bloodshot eyes onto mine. "So Maya," Trent said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register that echoed in the silent room. "This is where we see exactly what kind of person you really are. You hold all the cards right now. You have the forensic audit. You have the power to completely destroy my company. But doing so means you destroy your own parents." I met his gaze with absolute indifference. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. "I am not destroying anything, Trent," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I am simply reporting the facts of a financial investigation. You destroyed your own company the moment you decided to steal from your investors and fund a mistress in Miami." Trent shook his head, a cruel, desperate smirk twisting his lips. "The federal government does not care about the philosophy of the crime, Maya. They care about the paper trail. And the paper trail connects my offshore accounts directly to the commercial loans your father took out using fraudulent signatures. If you submit that report to Vanguard Capital, the authorities will audit my inbound cash flow. They will track the initial investments right back to Desmond and Valerie. They will discover the forged notary stamps. They will discover the fake collateral appraisals. They will uncover every single lie." He leaned closer, placing his hands flat on the mahogany dining table and leaning aggressively into my space. "Are you really going to be the one to send your own mother and father to a federal penitentiary? Are you really that cold? I know they were tough on you. I know they cut off your college fund, but they are your flesh and blood. Are you going to look them in the eye and condemn them to 10 years in a federal cell just to prove a point to me?" Desmond suddenly found his voice. He lunged forward, grasping the edge of the table. "Maya, please," he begged. His tone was entirely stripped of the arrogant rage he had directed at me just moments before. He clasped his hands together in a pathetic gesture of supplication, his eyes wide with unadulterated fear. "You cannot do this to us. We would lose everything. The house, the country club, our freedom. You have to fix this. You have to clear his audit." I looked at the man who had raised me, the man who had mocked my career, who had happily allowed his wife to drain my college tuition to buy a wedding dress for his favorite daughter. He was not apologizing for what he had done. He was not remorseful that he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own father. He was simply terrified of facing the consequences of his actions. Trent tapped the table to draw my attention back to him. "You have your secondary work phone right there on the floor, Maya. I saw it fall out of your bag when your mother threw it. Pick it up. Log into your executive dashboard. You are the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Forensic Partners. You have the administrative override clearance. You are going to access the Vanguard Capital file, erase the red flags, and issue a clean bill of financial health. You are going to approve the Series B funding. Vanguard wires me the $10 million tomorrow morning, and I quietly pay back the commercial loans your parents forged. The debt disappears. The crime disappears. Everyone walks away rich and free." Valerie stepped forward, stepping right over the shattered glass of my tablet. Her eyes were wide with a desperate, frantic hope. "Yes, Maya. Do you hear him? We can fix this. You just have to clear the audit. You have to save your family. You owe us that much after sneaking around and investigating us behind our backs." I stared at my mother, genuinely marveling at the boundless depths of her delusion. Even now, facing federal prison, she somehow believed I was the villain for discovering their crimes, rather than them being the villains for committing them. They honestly expected me to commit a federal felony, to compromise the integrity of my 8-year-old firm simply to shield them from their own staggering greed. Before I could respond to Trent's extortion attempt, a slow, deliberate sound echoed from the head of the table. Grandpa Silas pushed his heavy wooden armchair back. The scrape of the wood against the floorboards cut sharply through the frantic energy of the room. He stood up slowly, his joints popping, leaning heavily on his silver-handled cane. He was 78 years old, his body weathered by time and hard work, but his eyes burned with a fierce, uncompromising clarity that demanded absolute silence. He looked at Desmond. He did not look at him with anger or rage. He looked at him with absolute, unadulterated disgust. "You forged my name," Silas stated. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that carried the weight of absolute finality. Desmond visibly cowered, shrinking away from his father, as if trying to fold in on himself. "Dad, I had to do it. The bank was threatening foreclosure. The market was shifting. I needed the leverage to help Trent get his company off the ground. It was a temporary measure. I was going to pay you back with the venture capital money. I swear to you." "You stole my equity," Silas continued, stepping slowly away from his chair, ignoring Desmond's pathetic stammering excuses entirely. "You drained the college fund I explicitly set up for my granddaughter. You lied to my face for years while living in a house I paid for. You watched Maya struggle, working herself to the bone, sleeping in her car while you threw lavish parties and bought luxury cars for a con artist." "Dad, please?" Desmond whimpered, tears finally spilling down his red cheeks. Silas turned his piercing gaze toward Valerie. "And you. You stood by and facilitated every single lie. You threw this girl's belongings across the room and called her a failure, knowing full well you were spending her future on catering and floral arrangements. You are both nothing but parasites." Silas reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out his smartphone, his thumb hovering over the illuminated screen. "What are you doing, Dad?" Desmond asked, the panic in his voice escalating into pure, unhinged terror. "I am doing what my granddaughter is too professional to do right now," Silas replied, his tone hard as forged iron. "Trent thinks he can blackmail Maya into compromising her firm to save your skin. But he cannot blackmail me. I am calling the federal authorities myself. I am reporting the fraudulent commercial loans, the forged signatures on my equity accounts, and the theft of the educational trust. I am turning all of you in." The threat hit the room like a live grenade. Trent took a sudden step back, realizing his leverage was entirely vanishing. If Silas reported the forgery, the bank would immediately freeze Desmond's assets, the Vanguard audit would instantly become irrelevant, and the federal investigation would begin tonight. Valerie let out a feral, completely unhinged screech. She did not think. She simply reacted with the raw, violent desperation of an animal trapped in a snare. She lunged across the space between them. She threw her entire body weight at the 78-year-old man, her hands clawing wildly at his suit jacket. Valerie ripped the smartphone violently out of Grandpa Silas' hands, her manicured nails, leaving a long, bleeding scratch across his knuckles. With a vicious shove, she pushed Silas hard in the chest. The old man lost his balance, his cane clattering loudly to the floor as he collapsed backward, falling heavily into his dining chair with a sharp gasp of pain. Valerie spun around her chest, heaving her eyes wide and manic. She backed up against the heavy wooden double doors of the dining room, throwing her arms out to physically blockade the only exit. She clutched the stolen phone against her chest, panting like a wild dog cornered in an alley. "Nobody is calling anybody," Valerie shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the walls. Valerie's shrill voice vibrated against the fine crystal glassware lining the Thanksgiving table. The heavy mahogany double doors were sealed firmly behind her back. She stood spread-eagle against the polished wood, clutching Grandpa Silas's smartphone tightly against her chest. Her breath came in ragged, uneven heaves, her eyes darting frantically around the room like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. Grandpa Silas slumped slightly in his heavy wooden chair. He rubbed his chest where Valerie had violently shoved him, his breathing shallow, but his gaze burning with a cold, unrelenting fury. He looked at the woman who had just assaulted him, then slowly shifted his piercing eyes to his son. The absolute indignity of the moment hung heavily in the stagnant air. I felt a sharp, icy spike of pure rage bloom in the center of my chest at the sight of my grandfather being manhandled, but I forced my facial expression to remain an impenetrable mask of stone. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing my anger. Emotion was the only currency my parents understood, and I was completely starving them of it. Desmond saw his wife physically barricading the only exit and realized the invisible line of basic human decency had been crossed. The physical assault on his own father shifted the atmosphere in the dining room from a corporate fraud confrontation into a literal hostage situation. But instead of backing down, the sheer suffocating desperation fueled his malice. He turned slowly away from his weeping daughter and his terrified son-in-law, locking his heavy bloodshot gaze entirely onto me. He took 3 heavy, deliberate steps across the Persian rug until he was looming directly over my chair. His broad shoulders blocked the light from the chandelier, casting my section of the table in deep shadow. He leaned down, placing a heavy hand on each armrest of my chair, effectively trapping me against the edge of the mahogany table. "You are going to fix this," Maya, Desmond hissed. His voice had dropped the frantic shouting panic from moments ago, replacing it with a cold, calculated venom that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "You are going to take your secondary work phone out of your pocket right now. You are going to log into your secure email server. And you are going to draft a message directly to the Vanguard Capital Executive Board." I looked up at him, my expression utterly blank, leaning my head back slightly to maintain eye contact. "And what exactly am I writing, Dad?" "You are writing a full official retraction," he ordered, his breath smelling stale and sour. "You are going to tell them that there was a catastrophic glitch in your forensic software. You are going to explicitly state that Trent's offshore accounts have been fully verified, that his proprietary algorithms are sound, and that the Series B funding is cleared for immediate transfer tomorrow morning. You are going to sign it with your CEO title, you are going to send it, and you are going to copy Trent on the thread so I can see the confirmation." I did not move. I did not reach for my pocket. I simply sat there, breathing evenly, letting him continue to dig his own grave in front of the entire room. When I remained perfectly silent, Desmond's face twisted into an ugly, cruel sneer. He mistook my silence for hesitation. He honestly believed I was finally breaking under the weight of his patriarchal authority. "You really think you have a choice here?" Desmond mocked, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You think because you built some boutique accounting firm that you hold any real power in this family. You think a fancy title makes you untouchable. Let me remind you exactly who you are and whose roof is over your head. You live in my guest house, Maya. You sleep on my property. You park your car in my driveway. You exist entirely through our generosity." Valerie chimed in from the door, her voice trembling but vicious, eager to support her husband's extortion. "We let you stay there because we pitied you. We let you pretend you were part of this family despite what a massive, ungrateful disappointment you turned out to be. We gave you a place to live when nobody else wanted you." Desmond nodded, leaning in an inch closer, his face completely flushed with manic energy. "We own the narrative in this town, Maya. We built the social foundation of this family. I play golf with the bank presidents. Your mother runs the charity galas. If you do not send that email right now, I will not just kick you out of the guest house. I will drag your name through the mud at every country club, every corporate board meeting, and every financial institution in Atlanta." He leaned closer, his eyes widening with malicious intent. "I will tell them you are a vindictive, mentally unstable spinster who tried to frame her own brother-in-law out of petty jealousy. I will tell them you fabricated federal documents because you could not stand the fact that your younger sister found a wealthy husband while you ended up alone. Who do you think they are going to believe, Maya? The respected commercial real estate developer who employs half the town, or the ugly dropout daughter who hides in the backyard playing with spreadsheets?" Chloe, suddenly emboldened by her father's aggressive posture, wiped her ruined mascara from her cheeks and nodded furiously from the floor. "They will destroy you, Maya," she chimed in, her voice thick with venom. "Nobody will ever hire your firm again once Dad is finished with you. Send the email and save yourself. You have absolutely nothing without us." Desmond growled, his grip tightening on the wooden armrests of my chair, until his thick knuckles turned completely white. "You are a nobody. You have zero leverage in this room. Trent is passing that audit. The bank is getting their money, and my commercial loans are going to stay exactly where they are. Do you understand me? We control your life." I remained perfectly still, genuinely marveling at the sheer blinding arrogance of a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship, demanding that the ocean apologize to him. They still thought I was the broken 18-year-old girl they had thrown out into the cold. They had absolutely no concept of the wealth, power, and influence I had accumulated while they were busy maintaining their shallow suburban facade. "I am not sending the email, Desmond," I stated quietly, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Desmond slammed his open palm against the dining table. The violent sound cracked like a gunshot in the enclosed room, causing the remaining silverware to rattle sharply against the fine china plates. Grandpa Silas did not flinch, but Trent took a nervous step backward, pressing himself against the buffet table. "You are going to send it!" Desmond roared, losing the very last shred of his composure. The mask was gone. He was nothing but a desperate, terrified criminal trying to intimidate his way out of federal prison. "I am giving you exactly 5 seconds, Maya. 5 seconds to take your phone out of your pocket and start typing that retraction." He stood up straight, pointing a rigid finger at the front hallway. "If you do not comply, I will personally drag you by your hair out the front door. I will throw your bags onto the street. I will change the locks on the guest house tonight, and you will spend Thanksgiving sleeping on the pavement like the trash you are." 5. He began the countdown, his eyes feral, demanding submission. 4. Trent stood completely frozen by the wall, watching Desmond do his dirty work, playing the coward and letting someone else execute the extortion. 3. Valerie gripped the brass handles of the dining room doors behind her back, her posture rigid, physically preparing to lock me out of the main house forever the second Desmond gave the order. 2. I did not reach into my pocket. I did not pull out my secondary work phone. I did not panic, flinch, beg for mercy, or attempt to negotiate. Instead, I slowly, deliberately raised my left arm from my lap. I pulled back the starched cuff of my tailored blazer, exposing the custom platinum and diamond Patek Philippe watch resting coolly against my wrist. Desmond spat, his face twisted in absolute blinding fury. "You are done, Maya. You are homeless. Get out of my house." I tilted my wrist slightly, letting the ambient light from the chandelier catch the ring of flawless diamonds surrounding the watch face. I checked the position of the hands with casual, agonizing slowness, letting the silence stretch for one more unbearable second. "Actually, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through his pathetic ultimatum with absolute chilling clarity. The final wire transfer went through at exactly 4 p.m. today. The silence in the dining room stretched into a suffocating vacuum. Desmond stared at my wrist, his eyes darting between the glittering diamonds of my watch and the cold, unyielding expression on my face. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. The absolute certainty in my voice had completely derailed his momentum. He had expected me to cower, to beg, to frantically type out an email to Vanguard Capital under the sheer weight of his physical intimidation. Instead, I was checking the time. "What wire transfer?" Desmond finally managed to choke out, his voice reduced to a thin, brittle rasp. "What are you talking about?" "Vanguard does not process funding releases until the audit is fully cleared and submitted to their board. They do not send wires on Thanksgiving Day." "I am not talking about Vanguard Capital, Desmond," I replied, lowering my arm and resting my hands neatly on my lap. "I am talking about Sterling Forensic Partners. You and Valerie have spent the last 5 years operating under a profound delusion regarding exactly what it is I do for a living. You convinced yourselves I was a glorified data entry clerk. You told your country club friends I was a low-level bookkeeper because you were deeply embarrassed that I did not have a flashy corporate title like your golden son-in-law. But Sterling is not a bookkeeping service. We are a corporate liquidation and distressed asset recovery firm. We buy and dismantle failing companies." Valerie pressed her back harder against the heavy mahogany doors, her knuckles white as she gripped the brass handles. "She is lying, Desmond!" Valerie shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the patterned wallpaper. "She does not have any money. She lives in our guest house. She drives a sensible sedan. She is just trying to confuse you so you will not throw her out. Do not listen to a single word she says." I ignored my mother entirely. My eyes remained locked on my father, watching the gears slowly turning in his head as the horrific reality of his situation began to dawn on him. "When you forged Grandpa Silas' signature on those commercial loans, You fundamentally misunderstood how modern banking algorithms operate. I explained, adopting the precise, measured tone I used in corporate boardrooms. The bank flagged the discrepancies in the notary stamps 4 weeks ago. They immediately froze the credit lines and quietly moved your entire real estate portfolio into pre-foreclosure status. You were completely radioactive, Desmond. The bank was silently preparing to auction off every single property you claimed to own, including the very ground we are standing on right now. Desmond's face turned a sickening shade of ash gray. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. He gripped the back of his dining chair, his knuckles bulging. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in rapid, jerky movements. "No, that is impossible. My loan officer would have called me. They would have given me a grace period to secure the Vanguard funding. They know I am good for the money." "They did not call you because I intercepted the portfolio before it ever went to public auction," I stated coldly. "When a high-value commercial portfolio goes into default due to federal fraud, the bank wants the toxic assets off their books as fast as humanly possible to avoid regulatory scrutiny. My firm specializes in purchasing toxic debt for pennies on the dollar." Trent let out a sharp, ragged breath from his position against the wall. The charismatic tech executive was currently sweating through his designer shirt. He stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of the capital I wielded. "You bought the debt," Trent muttered, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You bought his commercial loans from the bank." "I did not just buy the loans, Trent," I corrected gently. "I bought the collateral." I stood up from my chair. Desmond instantly recoiled, pressing himself against the edge of the table as if I were holding a loaded weapon. I did not move toward him. Instead, I walked calmly around the spilled cranberry sauce and broken crystals scattered across the floor, making my way over to the side chair where Valerie had violently thrown my belongings. Valerie flinched as I approached, pressing herself flat against the dining room doors, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. She looked absolutely terrified, convinced I was coming to physically retaliate. I simply reached down, grabbed the thick leather handles of my tote bag, and pulled it upright. I unzipped the main compartment and reached inside. My fingers brushed past my secondary work phone and settled on the thick, heavy object resting at the bottom of the bag. I pulled it out. It was a heavy, notarized manila envelope. The exterior was stamped with the official seal of the Atlanta Commercial Property Registrar. I walked back to the head of the table. Desmond watched my every move with paralyzed, wide-eyed terror. I stopped right in front of him. I raised the heavy envelope and tossed it casually onto his empty china dinner plate. It landed with a loud, definitive smack that made both Chloe and Valerie jump. "Open it," I commanded. My voice was no longer a quiet whisper. It was an absolute, unbreakable directive. Desmond stared down at the manila envelope as if it were a venomous snake coiled on his plate. He was sweating profusely, a thick bead of perspiration rolling down his temple and dripping onto his starched collar. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Open the envelope, Desmond." I repeated, my tone dropping to a glacial chill. "You wanted to talk about who owns the roof over my head. You wanted to give me 5 seconds to vacate your property. Let us see exactly who has the authority to evict who." With trembling, uncoordinated hands, Desmond reached forward. His thick fingers fumbled clumsily with the metal clasp. He tore the top of the envelope, his breathing ragged and loud in the silent room. He reached inside and pulled out a massive, heavy stack of legal deeds and property titles. Each document was printed on thick, legal paper adorned with embossed seals and blue ink signatures. Desmond stared at the top page. His eyes scanned the heavy black text. I watched his pupils dart back and forth across the legal jargon, watching the exact moment his brain processed the irrefutable truth. His mouth fell open. A low, strangled sound escaped his throat, a pathetic noise of pure, unadulterated defeat. "What does it say, Dad?" Chloe demanded from her spot on the floor, her voice shrill and panicked. "What are those papers? Tell me what she did." Desmond could not answer her. He was completely paralyzed. His hands shook so violently that the thick stack of papers vibrated in his grip. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch had been entirely hollowed out, leaving nothing but a terrified old man holding the documented proof of his own ruin. Through a shell company registered under Sterling Forensic Partners, I paid the bank the exact sum required to clear the defaulted debt, I explained, projecting my voice so it reached every corner of the room. I paid off the fraudulent commercial loans you took out, using Grandpa Silas' stolen equity. The bank was thrilled to wash their hands of your criminal liabilities. And in exchange for clearing that debt, the bank legally transferred all associated collateral directly to my holding company. I leaned forward, resting my palms on the table, bringing my face inches from his sweating, terrified features. I own the commercial strip malls downtown. I own the luxury apartment complex in Midtown. And as of 4 p.m. today, when the final electronic wire transferred into the bank's escrow account, I officially own this estate. I own the guest house. I own the driveway. I own the roof over your head. You have absolutely nothing without my generosity. Chloe could not handle the silence any longer. She scrambled up from the wet floor, her heels slipping slightly on the hardwood. She shoved past Trent, marching directly up to her father. She snatched the heavy stack of legal papers right out of Desmond's trembling hands. "Let me see that," Chloe shrieked, her eyes wild with manic denial. She flipped frantically through the first few pages, her perfectly manicured nails crinkling the expensive legal paper. She scanned the bold print, desperately searching for a loophole, a mistake, a lie. Suddenly, Chloe stopped breathing. She froze, her eyes locked onto the bold notarized text at the top of the primary property deed. The color drained entirely from her face, matching her father's sickly pallor. She looked up at me, her expression a mask of absolute shattered horror. "Wait," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking, sounding like a frightened child. Chloe's voice trembled, her perfectly glossed lips parted in sheer disbelief. She held the heavy embossed parchment as if it were burning her fingers. Desmond tore the document from her hands with a violent jerk, his eyes darting frantically across the lines of dense legal text. He read it once, twice, a third time, his chest heaving with shallow, erratic breaths. The thick paper rattled loudly in his shaking grip, the sharp sound amplifying the deafening silence that had overtaken the room. Valerie abandoned her post at the dining room doors. The desperate need to maintain physical control of the room was instantly overridden by the terrifying revelation of Chloe's words. She scrambled to her husband's side, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Her eyes were wide and manic as she peered over his trembling shoulder, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the official seal of the county registrar. The room descended into a suffocating, breathless void, broken only by the sound of Desmond's ragged, panicked breathing. I stepped back, leaning casually against the edge of the mahogany table, crossing my arms over my chest. I allowed them to marinate in the absolute destruction of their reality. They had spent decades building a fortress of lies, funding country club memberships, luxury vehicle leases, and extravagant weddings on the back of my grandfather's hard work and my stolen future. They had looked down on me, mocked my sensible clothes, and ridiculed my quiet dedication, all while standing on a trapdoor they had built themselves. And with a single stack of paper, I had pulled the lever. "This is a forgery," Desmond rasped, his voice completely devoid of its former booming authority. It sounded thin, reedy, and desperate. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me, though he could not sustain eye contact for more than a second. "You printed these out in your little office to scare us. The family trust owns this estate. The trust is irrevocable. My father controls the trust, and I am the primary beneficiary. You cannot just magically put your name on a deed, Maya. This is a pathetic bluff." Grandpa Silas, who had been sitting quietly in his chair dabbing at the bleeding scratch on his knuckles where Valerie had violently clawed him with a linen napkin, let out a deep, humorless chuckle. It was a dry, hollow sound that echoed ominously off the high ceiling. "The trust was dissolved 6 months ago," Desmond Silas stated, his voice ringing with a cold, unwavering clarity that demanded absolute attention. Desmond snapped his head toward his father, his face twisting in a grotesque mask of confusion and horror. "What are you talking about? You cannot dissolve the trust without my signature. I am the sole heir. You promised me this estate. Silas leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table, fixing his son with a glare that could cut through solid steel. I am the sole grantor of that trust. I built the portfolio. I funded the accounts from nothing. I worked 70-hour weeks for 40 years to ensure this family had a legacy. And I retained the absolute legal right to dismantle the entire structure the exact second I discovered you had committed felony bank fraud using my name as collateral. You stopped being my heir the moment you became a thief. I watched Desmond's knees physically buckle under the crushing weight of his father's words. He slumped heavily into his chair, the legal deeds spilling from his lap onto the floor, scattering across the Persian rug like dead leaves. Did you honestly believe Grandpa was losing his mind, Dad? I asked, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick tension in the room. Did you think he was just some senile old man sitting in his recliner who would never notice hundreds of thousands of dollars hemorrhaging from his commercial accounts? He noticed the very first unauthorized withdrawal you made to fund Trent's fake software company. He noticed the forged notary stamps. He knew exactly what you were doing. But instead of confronting you blindly and giving you the chance to hide the money, he did what any intelligent, ruthless businessman would do. He hired a professional to trace the stolen assets. Trent backed further away, pressing himself deep into the corner of the room, looking like a cornered rat seeking a crack in the baseboards. You investigated us, Trent whispered, his voice cracking with sheer terror. Silas hired your firm. I did not just investigate you, Trent, I replied, shifting my gaze to the sweating tech executive. I forensically dismantled your entire financial existence. Grandpa Silas came to my office late one night in the pouring rain. He handed me the raw ledger data and asked me to find out where his life's work was bleeding out. It took my specialized team exactly 48 hours to uncover the offshore gambling syndicates, the Miami beachfront penthouse, the fake international vendor holds, and the staggering mountain of fraudulent loans Desmond had taken out to cover your massive sloppy tracks. You left a digital footprint so wide a first-year accounting student could have caught you. Valerie shook her head violently, her hands clutching her pearl necklace, as if it could somehow protect her from the incoming blow. We were protecting the family image, she cried out, her voice, shrill and desperate, tears finally spilling over her expertly contoured cheeks. We had to keep up appearances. If the country club found out we were struggling, we would have been completely ruined. The social humiliation would have destroyed us. We were going to pay it all back once Trent secured the Vanguard capital funding. It was just a temporary loan. You were never going to pay it back, Valerie, I countered, dropping the title of mother completely, the word turning to ash in my mouth. Because during my extensive audit of the commercial accounts, I discovered a much more immediate catastrophic problem. A problem so massive and so profoundly negligent that it threatened to render the entire federal fraud investigation completely moot. Desmond looked up at me, his eyes hollow and bloodshot, his jaw slack. What problem? I stepped toward him, projecting my voice so every single syllable landed with maximum punishing impact. You stopped paying the property taxes on the family estate. You had not made a single tax payment to the county in over 3 years. You diverted every available cent of liquid cash to maintain your country club dues, to lease Chloe's luxury imported SUVs, to buy tailored suits, and to keep Vanguard Capital from realizing Trent was a complete fraud. The county had already filed a massive tax lien against the property. The bank had issued the final notice of default. Chloe let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She looked at the expensive crystal chandelier above her, then at the custom silk drapes, as if the house itself were suddenly evaporating around her. She grabbed the edge of the buffet table to keep from collapsing entirely. You were exactly 48 hours away from total irreversible foreclosure. I continued, my words striking like a hammer against an anvil. The county sheriffs were literally scheduled to arrive at this front door, put heavy padlocks on the iron gates, and physically remove you from the premises. You were about to be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your backs. Your precious social standing was 2 days away from becoming front-page news in the local paper. Desmond buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, agonizing groan that sounded like a dying animal. He knew it was true. The facade was completely shattered. There was no more running, no more hiding behind fake wealth and stolen equity. Grandpa Silas could not let that happen, I explained, looking at the old man who was watching me with an expression of profound, unwavering pride. He could not allow the generational home he built with his own two hands to be seized and auctioned off by the bank because his son was a spineless, greedy coward obsessed with looking rich. But he also knew that if he simply paid the back taxes and cleared the lien, you would just leverage the house again the very next day to cover your next inevitable failure. He had to sever your access to the equity permanently. He had to surgically remove you from the asset. Silas nodded slowly, picking up his cane and resting his calloused hands on the silver handle. I dissolved the trust, he rumbled, his voice echoing with absolute authority. And I sold the entire estate, the main house, the guest house, the surrounding 30 acres directly to Sterling Forensic Partners. Maya's firm purchased the property in full. She paid off the massive tax lien you created. She settled the outstanding debt with the county. She owns every single square inch of this land. Valerie stared at me, her jaw hanging open, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and utter disbelief. "You own the house," she whispered the words, barely making it past her trembling lips. "You own everything." "I own the house, Valerie." I confirmed, my tone devoid of any sympathy, cold and clinical. "I own the title. I own the deed. I own the walls you are standing between. I own the driveway where Trent parks his leased luxury vehicles." Desmond slowly lowered his hands from his face. He looked at me, a sudden, desperate realization washing over his slack features. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence was completely extinguished, replaced by the pathetic confusion of a man realizing he had been outplayed on every conceivable level. "But you have been paying us rent," he stammered, his voice pathetic and weak. "You transfer money into our checking account on the first of every month for the guest house. You signed a standard lease agreement. We are your landlords. You pay us to live here." I looked down at the man who had mocked my career, who had stolen my education, who had threatened to drag me out of my own home by my hair just minutes earlier. I allowed a slow, cold smile to spread across my face, savoring the absolute perfection of the moment. "I don't pay rent, Dad," I said, my voice echoing in the dead silent dining room. Chloe's voice cracked, the heavy embossed parchment slipping from her trembling fingers. The thick pages fluttered downward, joining the scattered debris of shattered crystal and spilled water on the Persian rug. She stared at me, her perfectly contoured face contorted into a grotesque mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. The illusion of her flawless, wealthy existence was disintegrating right before her eyes, and her mind simply could not process the mathematics of her new reality. Desmond remained frozen in his heavy wooden dining chair. He stared blankly at the empty space on his plate where the manila envelope had landed just moments before. The dark, arrogant flush that perpetually colored his cheeks had completely vanished, leaving behind a sickly, translucent pallor. His broad shoulders slouched forward, and for the very first time in my 32 years of life, my father looked small. He looked entirely hollowed out, utterly defeated by the indisputable legal documentation of his own staggering incompetence. Valerie abandoned her defensive posture by the dining room doors. The desperate need to barricade the exit was instantly overridden by the terrifying revelation echoing through the room. She scrambled across the hardwood floor, her designer heels clicking frantically, and dropped to her knees beside her golden daughter. Valerie snatched the primary property deed from the rug, her hands shaking so violently the thick paper rattled aloud. Her eyes darted frantically across the bold legal print, scanning the signatures, the county registrar seals, and the indisputable transfer of ownership. "No," Valerie whispered, shaking her head in rapid, jerky movements. Her perfectly coiffed hair fell across her face, completely ruining her immaculate country club aesthetic. "No, this is a mistake. This is a clerical error." "Silas!" She looked up at my grandfather, her voice climbing into a shrill, desperate plea. Silas, tell her this is a mistake. You cannot sell the generational home to her. You promised this estate to Desmond. It belongs to us. Grandpa Silas did not offer her a shred of sympathy. He sat rigidly in his chair, his hands resting heavily on the silver handle of his cane. He looked down at his daughter-in-law with a cold, unrelenting judgment. I promised this estate to a son who would protect it. Silas rumbled, his voice echoing like grinding stones. I did not promise it to a reckless gambler who forged my signature to fund a fraudulent tech startup. You lost the right to this house the second you decided to steal my equity to lease luxury cars for Chloe. You do not own anything anymore, Valerie. Maya owns it all. Valerie let out a hollow, agonizing wail. She crumpled forward, clutching the property deed to her chest as if holding it tight enough could somehow reverse the transaction. I stood tall at the head of the mahogany table, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my family. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical clarity. Do you want to know the true tragedy of this situation, Desmond? I asked, my voice cutting cleanly through the sound of Valerie's quiet sobbing. Desmond slowly lifted his heavy, bloodshot eyes to meet mine. He looked completely shattered, a man who had just watched his entire empire burn to the ground in a matter of minutes. I was going to let you stay. I stated the absolute truth of the words, hanging heavily in the stagnant air of the dining room. Chloe snapped her head up from the floor, her tear-streaked face frozen in confusion. Trent stopped his frantic pacing by the buffet table, staring at me as if I had suddenly begun speaking a foreign language. When Grandpa Silas came to my firm and we uncovered the sheer magnitude of your financial crimes, I had a choice to make. I continued, my tone perfectly, even and devoid of emotion. I saw the foreclosure notices. I saw the tax liens. I saw that the county sheriffs were scheduled to put padlocks on these iron gates in exactly 48 hours. And despite everything you have ever done to me, despite you stealing my college tuition, despite you treating me like a second-class citizen in my own family, I could not stomach the thought of watching Grandpa Silas stand on the sidewalk while the bank auctioned off his legacy. I stepped away from my chair, slowly pacing the length of the dining table, forcing every single person in the room to follow my movements. I bought the debt to save the family name, I explained, looking directly at my mother, who was still kneeling on the rug. I was prepared to be your silent landlord. I was going to quietly pay off the defaulted property taxes. I was going to absorb the catastrophic financial hemorrhage Trent caused. I was going to let you keep your country club memberships. I was going to let you keep your Tuesday morning tennis matches and your luxury leased vehicles. I was going to allow you to continue living in this beautiful, opulent fantasy world, pretending you were the elite of Atlanta. Desmond let out a ragged, trembling breath, burying his face in his hands. The realization of what he had just thrown away was visibly crushing him. All you had to do was stop stealing, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. All you had to do was swallow your pride, admit that Trent was a monumental fraud, and let him face the federal consequences of his own actions. I was perfectly willing to shield you from the fallout. I was willing to let you stay in my house. I stopped pacing, planting my feet firmly on the hardwood floor. I crossed my arms over my chest, letting the righteous anger I had suppressed for decades finally bleed into my voice. But you could not do that, could you? I sneered, staring down at my father. Your ego was too massive. Your arrogance was too blinding. Instead of taking the lifeline I secretly built for you, you decided to attack me. I pointed a sharp finger at Desmond. You stood over my chair and threatened to ruin my firm. You threatened to drag my professional reputation through the mud at every financial institution in this city. I shifted my finger to Valerie. You threw my belongings across the room, called me an ugly failure, and demanded I be thrown out onto the street by midnight. Valerie flinched violently, closing her eyes and shrinking away from my pointing finger. You literally threatened to make your own daughter homeless to protect a con artist who was simultaneously funding a mistress in Miami with your stolen money. I stated the absolute absurdity of their choices, echoing loudly in the room. You chose the illusion of wealth over your own flesh and blood. You chose a criminal over me. Trent opened his mouth, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of defense. Maya, please. I can explain the Miami transfers. I can. Shut your mouth, Trent. I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip, instantly silencing him. You do not get to speak anymore. Your beta launch is over. I turned my back on my brother-in-law and walked calmly back to my leather tote bag resting on the side chair. I reached into the front pocket. My fingers bypassed my secondary work phone and grasped the final folded document I had prepared before driving to the estate this afternoon. I pulled it out, turning back to face my parents. I was willing to be your silent savior, I said, my voice dropping back to a quiet, dangerous whisper. I was willing to let you live in my house for free. But since you just explicitly threatened to destroy my career to protect a felon, the charity ends today. I walked directly up to Valerie. She was still kneeling on the floor, clutching the property deed, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I did not hand her the document. I snapped my wrist forward and slapped the folded piece of paper directly onto her chest. Valerie gasped reflexively, bringing her hands up to catch the paper before it fell. She unfolded it with trembling, uncoordinated fingers. That is a 30-day eviction notice, I said, my voice echoing with absolute, uncompromising finality in the dead silent dining room. You have exactly 1 month to get out of my house. Desmond let out a hollow, agonizing sob. Chloe buried her face in her hands, weeping openly, as the reality of her impending poverty completely shattered her mind. Valerie stared at the eviction notice, her mouth opening and closing in silent, hyperventilating panic. Trent was the first to realize the true gravity of the situation. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors, silently calculating his escape route before the Vanguard audit was officially submitted. He took a slow, stealthy step toward the exit. But before Trent could reach the brass handles, a sound sliced through the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. It started as a faint, distant wail cutting through the quiet suburban night. Within seconds, the sound grew exponentially louder, sharper, and infinitely more terrifying. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens echoed in the distance, rapidly growing louder as they turned up the private driveway. Flash after flash of strobing red and blue lights began to bounce aggressively against the dining room windows, illuminating the horrified faces of my family in a chaotic, rhythmic pulse. The strobing red and blue lights painted the dining room in a chaotic, dizzying disco of impending doom. The wail of the sirens cut off abruptly, replaced immediately by the heavy crunch of thick tires violently braking on the gravel driveway and the aggressive slamming of car doors outside. Trent completely broke. The slick, arrogant tech executive evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a terrified, cornered rat, facing the absolute reality of federal prison. He scrambled backward, bumping hard into the buffet table, sending a silver gravy boat crashing to the hardwood floor. His breathing turned into rapid, shallow squeaks. He looked frantically at the front hallway, then back at Desmond. With a sudden, violent burst of self-preservation, Trent shoved Chloe aside. He pushed his own wife with such blind force that she stumbled backward, her heels catching on the rug, sending her crashing hard against the decorative wainscoting. It was them! Trent screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at Desmond and Valerie. I did not forge anything. It was Desmond's idea. They manipulated me. They said they had the capital to float the beta launch. I did not know the notary stamps were fake until it was too late. I am a victim here. They set me up. Chloe pushed herself up from the floor, her hair wild and her designer dress rumpled. Her mind already fracturing from the revelation of her impending poverty, and her husband's Miami mistress completely shattered at the sight of Trent throwing her parents to the wolves to save his own skin. A feral, unhinged scream ripped from her throat. She lunged at him. Chloe slammed her fist into Trent's chest, her manicured nails digging deep into his expensive silk shirt. She tore at the fabric, ripping the collar and sending tiny pearl buttons scattering across the floor like teeth. "You lying, cheating coward!" Chloe shrieked, swinging wildly as Trent raised his arms to shield his face, cowering against the expensive wallpaper. "You ruined my life. You ruined everything. You promised me we were going to be billionaires." Before Trent could push her away, the heavy mahogany doors of the dining room were shoved open with explosive force. 5 armed police officers, accompanied by 2 men wearing dark windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in stark yellow letters across the back, stormed into the room. Federal agents. Nobody move. The lead agent shouted, his voice cutting cleanly through Chloe's hysterical screaming and Trent's pathetic whimpering. The officers moved with tactical precision. They immediately separated Chloe and Trent, pinning Trent hard against the wall, while 2 other officers moved to flank Desmond. Desmond stared at the federal agents, his chest heaving, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. Maya. Desmond choked out, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. You called them. Tell them to leave. We can fix this internally. I did not call them tonight, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly calm amid the absolute chaos tearing through the room. I submitted my firm's complete forensic audit, along with the irrefutable proof of your forged notary stamps, and Trent's offshore wire transfers directly to the FBI field office 3 days ago. They have been building the warrant all week. Tonight was simply the scheduled pickup. The lead FBI agent pulled a stack of folded warrants from his inner jacket pocket. Trent Lawson, you are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit federal bank fraud. Trent began to sob openly as the cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists, locking his hands behind his back. He begged the officers, pleading that he would testify against Desmond, promising he had emails to prove his innocence, but the agents ignored him entirely. They spun him around and marched him roughly toward the front door. The agent then turned his attention to my father. Desmond Wilson, you are under arrest for felony identity theft, multiple counts of forgery, and federal bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you finally take advantage of that right, Desmond, I added, watching the officers pull his heavy arms behind his back. As the handcuffs locked around Desmond's wrists with a harsh metallic snap, the very last shred of his towering patriarchal arrogance vanished. The man who had spent my entire life telling me I was a worthless disappointment, the man who had literally threatened to throw me onto the street 30 minutes prior, suddenly dropped to his knees. The sudden movement dragged the 2 arresting officers down with him. Maya, please. Desmond sobbed, his voice reduced to a pathetic, wet whine. The veins bulged in his neck as he looked up at me. You are my daughter. You are my brilliant, successful daughter. You have the money. You can fix this. You can pay my bail. You can hire the best defense team in the state. Please, Maya, I am your father. Do not let them take me. Valerie, seeing her husband kneeling on the floor in handcuffs, completely unraveled. She crawled across the ruined Persian rug, her expensive dress soaking up the spilled water and wine from the shattered glasses. She reached my position at the head of the table and threw her arms around my legs. Her fingers desperately grasped the hem of my tailored skirt, her perfectly manicured hands shaking violently. Maya, I am so sorry, Valerie wailed, burying her tear-streaked face against my knees. I am so sorry for everything. We were wrong. You are so smart. You are so perfect. Please forgive us. Please do not take the house. Do not leave me penniless on the street. I have nowhere to go. I will do anything you want. I will clean the guest house. Just please let me stay. I looked down at the woman who had spent the last decade making me feel like an unwelcome ghost in my own family. I looked at the man begging for my wealth after mocking my career for years. I took a deliberate, measured step backward. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my skirt from Valerie's desperate, clutching grip. Without my legs to support her, she slumped forward onto the hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably into her empty hands. I am sorry, Valerie, I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. But my money is for people building a legacy, not for criminals. I turned my back on them. I walked over to Grandpa Silas, offering him my arm. He took it, leaning heavily on his cane, and together we walked out of the dining room. We did not look back as the federal agents hauled Desmond up from the floor and marched him out the front door. Valerie and Chloe were left weeping on the floor of a house they no longer owned, their entire fake empire reduced to absolute dust. The flashing red and blue lights eventually faded into the distance, taking the toxic, suffocating elements of my past life with them. The sprawling estate was finally quiet, the heavy silence of the house no longer oppressive but deeply cleansing. An hour later, the crisp November night air brushed across the back patio. I sat at the wrought iron table next to Grandpa Silas. Between us sat the Thanksgiving pie I had baked that morning. It was slightly battered from the chaos of the dining room, but it was still perfectly warm. I cut 2 generous slices, sliding one onto a clean porcelain plate and handing it to him. Silas took the plate, his weathered hands steady. He looked out over the manicured lawn, the dark silhouette of the guest house, and the expansive property line that was now legally secured from the bank. He turned to me, the hard, uncompromising lines of his face softening into a genuine, deeply proud smile. He reached out and patted my hand gently. "This house is finally in good hands," Maya Silas said quietly. I picked up my fork and took a bite of the sweet, warm pie. I looked out over the sprawling estate that was now mine, feeling the cold night air fill my lungs. For the first time in my entire life, I was finally at peace. Family is not merely defined by bloodlines. It is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect and genuine support. When toxic relatives exploit your loyalty and consistently underestimate your worth, walking away is never a failure. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. True power comes from independently building your own success and establishing unshakable boundaries against those who only value you for what they can extract. Share your experience in the comments if you have ever had to draw a hard line with toxic family members to protect your peace. Hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering stories of resilience and reclaiming your worth.